Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Tonight's episode of the last 10 nights of Ramadan with Sister Roua is about gratefulness and contentment versus pursuing Dunya. Roua Eltayeib graduated with a double major in biology and psychology from the City College of New York and earned her master's in marriage and family therapy, aka LMFT, from Mercy University. As a licensed MFT, she currently works in private practice focused on individuals and couples. To the Muslim American Society, especially the Brooklyn and Staten Island chapter Social Services Department, she aims to create more space for open conversations around mental health, normalize seeking therapy, and provide more accessibility to resources already in the community. She hopes to bridge the communication gap between the Muslim community and mental health professionals, both Muslim and non-Muslim. And I'll present to you Sister Roua Eltayeib.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Let me just get my mic on and then I'm not used to using this. Should I use it? Up to you. Assalamu alaikum. How's everybody doing tonight?
Good, alhamdulillah.
I'm good, alhamdulillah. I'm not used to talking this late or being like this active-minded this late, so bear with me, okay? Alright, so today's topic is about balancing contentment and ambition in the dunya. So we're really going to get through a couple of different things. One, we're going to start with an understanding of contentment first. What does that mean? What does ambition mean? What does that even look like? Then we're going to get into pitfalls of what excessive ambition can do, and then how we cultivate contentment and what that looks like. How do we foster it on our day-to-day? And then how do we find a balance through that? All right? Does that make sense? Okay. So, to start off with contentment, I think one of the things that I always like to talk about when it comes to contentment, what feelings come up for you guys when you think of contentment? Being content. What feeling immediately comes to mind?
Like being at peace.
Being at peace. Satisfaction. Okay. Any others on this side? Okay. I'm going to do that a lot during this talk because I hate just lecturing, so I like to know that you guys are engaged with me, okay? When I think of contentment, what I usually think about is happiness, because often a lot of people will come into the therapy room, for instance, and what's the first thing they say? I want to be happy, right? And so usually what I'll do is I'll challenge that. Why do you want to be happy, right? Ultimately, when I look at happiness, it's a very fleeting emotion. It lasts maybe a couple seconds, a couple minutes, maybe a couple hours, right? But it's generally a very temporary feeling versus what I like to look at contentment as is more of a state of mind. It's very long term. It is an overall picture of what your emotional state looks like. And so to achieve that means that you could still go through difficulty, you could still go through failure, you could still have a misstep here and there, but you will still feel content, ultimately, right? So I pulled up two definitions in particular because I think they really kind of grasp what contentment is. Psychology Today article describes it as a general hum of satisfaction that resonates through the soul. It's a pretty good definition. And then Oscar Wilde describes it as true contentment is not having everything, but in being satisfied with everything you have, right? So feeling content doesn't mean that you won't fail. It doesn't mean you won't trip up. It doesn't mean that you won't make mistakes. What it does mean is that there are, in those instances, how you respond or how you feel when that comes up will be different than if you're just momentarily happy, right? Because the happiness will disappear the second something goes wrong. Versus content, you might respond actually genuinely different if you feel that. So our satisfaction, and I want you guys to remember this, because when I talk about ambition, this particular thing is going to come up. Our satisfaction in life is based on how reality measures up to our expectations, right? Our satisfaction is based on how reality matches up to our expectations. If it matches up, we feel more satisfied. If it doesn't, and those expectations are skyrocketing, then that's when we feel a sense of dissatisfaction. All right, does that make sense? Thumbs me up. All right. So with ambition in particular, ambition is more a passionate determination to achieve a certain goal. It's often a quality that we'll place onto leaders and things like that. When we talk about leaders in history, right, we talk about them being ambitious. But it also comes in different shades. Ambitious being a good quality or a bad quality, right? And so when it comes to determining whether ambition is really kind of more positive or negative influence in terms of your life, it's really about how you utilize it and what outcome comes from it. So that is all dependent on what's influencing the actual ambition. Where is your ambition actually rooted? And for that, there's a couple of different influences, both negative and positive, all depending on who you are as a person, where you come from, what you engage with, things like that. So these are just a couple examples. There's way more examples out there, but these are just a few so you can think about ambition as it relates to you. Personal motivation. It's ambition that is very much stemming from your own individual goals and aspirations. So, for instance, growing up, you very much saw a doctor who took care of your family or someone in your family, and it's a goal now that you have to become a doctor and do the same thing, right? That is a personal motivation, and that ambition drives you to achieve that goal. Or you can have jealousy or envy motivating your ambition, right? If we think about what it looks like to really want to compare ourselves or see others succeed, and we're envious of that, and we want to succeed even better than they do, right? You might see this, for instance, in sibling dynamics. Sometimes you'll have parents comparing siblings, and when that happens, you'll see envy and jealousy kind of created in that. And when that happens, one sibling is trying to achieve over another, and that is a drive for ambition, but it's not exactly rooted in the most positive thing, right? An increase in confidence in your abilities. If you genuinely have a confidence in your own self-assuredness and you believe in your abilities, that drives your ambition. If you're more confident in your abilities, you're going to have more of a motivation and determination to achieve what your goals are. If anything, you'll probably be more sure of your goals, right? Or the opposite, actually, which is interesting. A lack of motivation can also be a driving influence in terms of ambition. And where it kind of stems from is when we have our success in particular compared to others, right? We actually start to overcompensate because we perceive or we think that others perceive us as less confident or not able, and so we start to overcompensate and maybe even overpromise the things that we're actually able to do, right? And so when that happens, that's a driving force for our ambition, but isn't exactly rooted in the most positive thing. We could also have fear of failure, right? We actually are afraid that we're not meeting the expectations of other people, and so we're driven and determined to achieve what they expect of us, but that isn't always technically aligned with what it is that we want, right? So that even is rooted in something that isn't exactly positive. And then the last one I wanted to hit on here is survival, because this can be the case for a lot of people. Survival aimed at success of something because you're instinctively driven to survive a certain situation, or you think that this is the best for you to be able to survive a circumstance, right? So your determination to achieve that goal is driven by that innate form of survival. That's a motivation in itself to become ambitious, right? So all of that to say, a lot of what you'll see with ambition is that if it's grounded in something that is very much more about a comparison to another person, or very much about what your goals are within this dunya, or it's a quality that you start to become that is more of an ailment of the heart or a disease of the heart, that's usually where you'll find that it's actually not grounded in something positive and leads to you being more excessively ambitious. So we'll get to excess ambition in a bit. But what I really wanted to hone in on before I ask you guys a question is, when it comes to ambition and creating the sense of balance, it's really kind of a reflection back on our nafs and ourself, right? It's this training that we need to do to kind of build on our character and our sense of self, and to work at that intentionally and reflect on that intentionally so that we can work towards our goal in the service of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If that constant reflection back doesn't happen, you don't have that step of recognizing when your ambition has stepped too far, right? If you don't have that reflection piece, you'll step too far. Ambition is a feedback loop. It is very much in and of itself. You accomplish something that feeds your desire, and then you want to achieve more to feed that desire further, right? So if you don't take a step back, that is a very intoxicating cycle in itself, right? So it is possible to develop a healthier relationship with ambition and to make sure that there is containment around that doesn't influence your life in a bad way if you're doing that feedback loop of self-reflection as well, if you're including that within that cycle. Now for you guys, in thinking about ambition and success in itself, how exactly do you define success in your life? Is it defined by specific goals that you want to achieve? And then once you get to that goal, you just create a different goal? Is it based on what you feel in any given moment, and that kind of drives where you go next? Is it driven by future worries? What does success look like for you guys? And that's an actual question, it's not rhetorical. Consistency? Okay.
Discipline.
Discipline, interesting.
Balance.
Balance, nice.
A problem being solved.
A problem being solved. Okay, so I'm imagining once the problem solved, achieve the goal. Success. Alright. Anyone else? When you think of success in your life? Okay. Good answers. So now let's talk about the pitfalls of excess ambition. What does that look like? So before we even get into what excess ambition looks like, or what I've hinted at already, we want to think about how exactly we determine when we've stepped too far. What are the actual indicators for how we do that? Or how do we even know in ourselves when we've stepped too far, right? One of the things I want to talk about is the heart in particular. Because the heart is a very important organ, not just physically, because without it we're not going to live. But beyond that, it's also how you feel in any given moment. You'll feel it if it just doesn't feel right, right? So the Prophet ﷺ said, beware, there is a piece of flesh in your body. If it becomes good, reformed, the whole body becomes good. But if it gets spoiled, the whole body gets spoiled, and that is the heart, right? So spiritual purification, essentially, is this idea of us really kind of keying into what our heart is telling us. It's reflecting on it, because it's very unpredictable. It's very volatile if we don't reflect. So it takes more attention and greater care in order for us to be able to know when it does not feel comfortable. You'll know in a moment where you are surrounded by the people who may not necessarily be the best, you'll feel it in your heart. When you're in an environment that doesn't exactly feel the best, you'll feel it in your heart, right? So all that is going to also tell you when you've maybe stepped too far in terms of ambition. And that is something, a blessing from Allah, if anything, right? The fact that we can still feel even the slightest discomfort when we are doing something that is slightly off the mark, right? If we're not listening to that voice, we're also not listening to a mercy that Allah has given us, essentially, to be able to turn back or be able to come back onto the path, right? And then in combination with reflecting on the heart is also about reflecting on what our internal state is and our external, and this feedback loop between the two. Our internal state is essentially everything unseen, from our feelings to our desires, our emotions. This is everything nobody else sees. This is pretty much internal, right? If anything, the only person that sees is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. A strong sense of self means that we are more self-aware, and we have more clarity essentially in our values, our emotions, what it is we need and want, our purpose, and things like that. Issues start to arise if we're too internal. We're stuck in the internal essentially, because it's not a good thing to be on either end. If we're too much in our internal state, the state of reflection, what ends up happening is we actually fail to recognize the action we need to take. Right? You can reflect all you want about the fact that you have this problematic behavior or this one, but ultimately, if you're not moving into action, it stays problematic, right? Have you ever heard those people who are very much like, I know what my problem is, I just haven't done anything about it, right? That's you staying within that internal realm. It's that internal state. You know what you internally feel, but your external is not reflecting that in any way. Now the external is more the demands of life. It's navigating your school, your work, your home, right? And other worldly things. This is also the actions and the choices that you make that other people will see, right? So the issue here arises when we focus too much on the external now, it doesn't actually match up with what we feel and value internally, right? So you might have people, an example I like to give is when I think about the reason people have midlife crises, for instance. Now there's more quarter-life crises for a reason. But midlife crisis, when we think about the midlife crisis, the reason it happens is actually because for a lot of us, most of our life is focused on work and trying to achieve our career and get to a place where we're stable. And then by the time we stabilize in that way, we start to realize actually, no, I really do want to spend more time with my family. I do want a circle of people that I can actually connect with. I do want community, right? And so that transition point is often what a lot of people are experiencing as a midlife crisis, essentially, right? It's this reorienting of the external being more aligned with your internal. That's what you're feeling. That's the crisis you're actually feeling. So externally, if you just focus on what other people are seeing and what you want to be perceived as, when going back to ambition, for instance, if you're constantly comparing yourself to how other people see you or what other people are doing, right? And it doesn't actually match up with what it is you want. For instance, if we're going back to jealousy and envy, right? If you're jealous of your sibling for achieving, I don't know, becoming a doctor, and you just haven't gotten there, right? Ultimately, let's go back to the internal. Is that even something that you want, or do you just want it because your sibling has it, and you've seen what what they received from parents or whatever it may be, or how other people perceive them for that, right? So this feedback loop of checking in on your internal self, where your values, where you lie in terms of your motivation, your purpose, and then going externally as well. How are you pushing that into action? Does your action reflect what you feel internally? And this back and forth is what's going to help you note when you have become too excess in terms of ambition and how you're achieving your goals and where it's influenced by. Does that make sense? Okay. If you guys have any questions, by the way, you can feel free to interrupt. I can also talk a mile a minute. It's the New Yorker in me. Okay. So now, what does it look like to be excessively ambitious? That can result in a couple of different things. When we're excessively ambitious, one of the things that can happen is we have poor follow-through in a lot of things. And poor decision-making as well. Because what we're doing is over-promising things and not being able to deliver on it. As Muslims, when we make a promise to something, we need to be able to fulfill it. If anything, that is a mark of a good Muslim, is being able to fulfill your promises. Now, if you're overly ambitious about something, what are you doing? You're likely saying that you can do something or thinking you can achieve something that actually isn't within the reality or scope of what you can actually do. And so what do? You promise something, you overpromise something, and then you don't meet that promise. You underperform. And that actually leads to a second piece, losing the trust of other people. When you're overpromising constantly, people aren't going to trust you in the same way, right? Have you ever had friends who very much they're like, I promise I'll do this for you, and they don't end up following through. Or it's about money, right? They'll promise they'll give you money back during this time or whatever it may be, or I'll make your money back by this time, and it doesn't happen, right? That lack of follow through is when you're saying you can achieve something that isn't within reality, right? This is going back to that definition of does reality match up with expectations, right? Decreasing your sense of self-esteem and self-worth. And why does that happen? Because you're constantly comparing yourself to other people. When you're overly ambitious, often what is happening is you're also comparing yourself to what other people have. If we're talking about jealousy, if we're talking about unhealthy competitiveness, if we're talking about a lack of confidence, right? That's all dependent on other people. If other people didn't exist in that equation, we wouldn't be comparing to anybody else. That is leading innately to a decrease in self-esteem and self-worth. So what you're noting there is that these qualities that come from comparing to someone else is leading to these things that are diseases of the heart. That you'll notice when that doesn't feel right. And so listening to that is telling you take a step back. Reflect on where this is grounded. Why are you doing what you're doing? Negative self-pressure and expectations. If you're continuing to kind of, and this is going back to that contentment definition, right? Based on how reality measures up to our expectations. If you are putting your expectations way too high and it's not realistic, that's not going to help you. If anything, you are ultimately setting yourself up for failure. That doesn't mean don't pursue things. It doesn't mean don't kind of give up on your dreams, but be realistic about those dreams. right? And we'll get into how exactly to do that and how to be content and what it is you decide to do in a bit. So while we think that we will finally be satisfied when we arrive at a goal, ultimately, goals have a tendency to change. Whether it's our next promotion, buying a new house, whatever it is, that goal post is constantly going to move. And so if our ambition and our drive and our motivation is grounded in that goal itself, you're going to lose that, or it's going to get too much, right? Versus if you're actually putting your ambition around how am I achieving it? How am I achieving my goal? What is influencing my goal? If your focus is on that instead, that actually will ground you a lot more, but also sustain you further. Because now your focus isn't on the dunya and the things that very much are going to fall through or change from. If you're 20 now, your goals are going to be very different than when you're 30, right? And so if those goals keep changing, you want to ground yourself in what is beyond this dunya. If you ground yourself beyond that, that's going to be most helpful for you. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So for you guys, have you ever experienced a sense of like anxiety or depression? I use those terms very loosely, by the way. When I say anxiety, it's very much around like a heavy concern for the future, and with depression, I very much like to see it as very much like a rumination of the past. Very much like being stuck in looking at your past mistakes and not being able to move forward from them, right? So have you ever experienced anxiety or depression as a result of striving for something excessively, for a goal very much excessively? And how exactly did it affect your mental health? It's so I know you guys are also kind of reflecting on what I'm talking about.
Personally, I shut down. Yeah, like I need the situation to be over in order for me to rebalance.
Gotcha. Okay. So you've essentially kind of strove to something, and then ultimately it's too much, and it's a shutdown that happens instead. Yeah. You were reading it?
I remember one time, like back in middle school, I remember we were doing like high school applications. I remember I studied, like I pulled all liners, I did way too much. And I realized to myself that I was maybe doing a bit too excessively. Like I was maybe studying too hard. In the end, I realized I was still getting the same results whether I studied or not.
Interesting.
And I wasted time with my friends, family, and it led to me doing some stuff that I may have regret.
How did you know you were doing it too excessively? Like, what gave you that indication?
Because I have a busy schedule. First, I wake up to go to school. I have soccer practice. I work at a small job for like small pay. And plus, I get tutoring for SAT as well. Plus, finishing school late.
That's a lot.
And one day, I realized it was just going to get stressful. I sat by myself. I'm like, I'm really stressing myself out. Something has to give.
Something has to give. It can be very overwhelming. I think.
No, I didn't just cry on the wall and be like, oh, I'm screwed. I sat myself and I thought, I'm like, what is the most rational thing I could think of?
Okay. That helped you, kind of reasoning it out, essentially. Okay.
I've experienced that like in a healthy way. Like you go about something the wrong way, and then you do a little bit of self-reflection, and then it helps you overcome it for the next time.
I like that. So it's that feedback loop you're noting in your cycle. So it's when you were starting to feel like something was a bit too excessive, it was kind of just reflecting back and taking a step back. And that helping actually how you execute it the next time around.
I think something that I've noticed within myself is like having an adjustment period. So even if something doesn't work out, yeah, it would hit hard, but I think what helps is just giving myself that time to adjust to that circumstance, and then realizing later like why it was the best for me.
What's that? Okay, so it's like a period of pause. It's just like genuine, intentional reflection for the next time. I don't think a lot of people give themselves that, especially when they're transitioning to something new, or even right after they fail at something. I think people have a tendency to jump into the next thing rather than really kind of look at, okay, what exactly happened here? What went wrong? And it's not to say you get stuck in that zone, but some people move too fast from it, and then they're still kind of stuck in that zone because they didn't even give it a chance to breathe. And that is usually the thing that hurts a lot of people in the process. Anyone else? Okay. All right. Now, what does it look like to cultivate contentment? So, I'm going to give, let's see, how many are these? There are 7. So if you're taking notes, there's 7 ultimately. But contentment is a very difficult state to work on because what it requires is intentionality and practice. Which honestly, as Muslims, we know that's exactly what we need to get anything into our routine, whether it's consistent salah or it's consistent adhkar, maybe. All of that, we need consistency, intention, and practice, right? That's the same for contentment. If you're trying to achieve a sort of contentment in your life, it's going to take intention and practice. Gratitude is one. It's being able to practice it in your day-to-day by potentially shifting your focus from what you're lacking versus what's abundant. When we're in that, and this is not to say that in moments where you're dealing with a crisis or something has gone wrong, it's not to say jump into what do you actually have, because I think a lot of times what a lot of people will do is there's this idea of like toxic positivity where you just jump straight to, no, but you have this, just be grateful for this. It's give time to breathe for the negative emotion or whatever it is that's overwhelming you, what you're feeling, and also create a balance. This is where you're finding balance. It's not just about what's lacking, but what are you also abundant in, right? It's practicing that. But it's also reflecting on what big or small do you have in your life? What are you abundant in? I think sometimes we focus on like we need the big things to be going well. But honestly, the small things, when they add up, they genuinely have an impact. And if you can note those small things, it very much has a large impact on how you now view your life or what you view your day-to-day looking like. Expressing gratitude also strengthens that. If you're saying it in your relationship, have you ever had a conversation with your friend where you were just super appreciative and you've like told them in a text or a conversation and you came out of that conversation actually being more grateful than you were before? Yeah? I know I felt that numerous times with my friends. I'll go in already feeling grateful, but then after expressing it, you're feeling it 10 times over. And that's because you're reinforcing that sense of gratitude by now vocalizing it as well. So gratitude, huge. Mindfulness is your second one. It is being able to be present in any given moment. And I think when we think of mindfulness generally, a lot of us will see it as like this Western concept. It's when you do yoga or when you do like deep breathing and things like that. But ultimately what mindfulness truly means is you're present in a moment and you're able to focus intentionally on that. What do you know that we do on our day-to-day that we need to be intentional with? Call them out. Salah. Anything else that we need to be intentional with when we're doing it in our day-to-day as Muslims?
Family time.
Family time. I like that actually. I didn't hear. Okay. Prayer. We said prayer. Dua. Adhkar. All of those take some intention to it, right? When we're making wudu, intention is huge as Muslims. If you don't have the intention, like you can't have a present moment unless you have intention first. You can't be present to a moment unless you have that intention first, right? So mindfulness is all about that. It's about being mindful in any given moment when you're acting on anything. You're being mindful of why you're doing it. Whose purpose are you doing it for, right? If you're making prayer, the only way that you're really kind of going to move towards a sense of khushu', for instance, is if you're mindful that you're doing this for the sake of Allah. I actually had a friend who attended a Maghrib class, and she referenced this in our usra not too long ago, and it like changed my mindset about salah. But looking at how when we start salah we say Allahu Akbar, like if you really think about it, you're saying that Allah is great. Like in that moment where you're starting salah, you are highlighting Allah is greater than anything I have my mind on right now. Allah is the greatest, and I'm going into salah vocalizing that. If you're intentional and really kind of mindful of the moment you're saying it, that already shifts your focus on salah. And so I've been doing it in my salahs, and I realize even when I have like a client coming or like I know a session coming and I feel it rushed, all of a sudden in that moment you're intentional and you slow down a bit. You start to slow down in your breath. You start to be more mindful in the moment and you move forward from there. Goal setting. Reasonable and achievable goals. When we talked about contentment, what did we say? It's realistic versus expectations, if those things are on the same level, you're going to feel more sense of contentment and satisfaction. If your expectations are up here and you're setting goals that are not achievable or not realistic, you're going to set yourself up for failure. So it's making very reasonable and achievable goals. And you're also reflecting on those goals and making sure that they also align with your values, right? So when we talk about internal and external states, right? We don't want to just make the external goal and achieve it. You also want to make sure the action that you're taking is aligned with what you value internally. If it isn't, then you're not going to necessarily have the same sense of ambition. It's not going to be grounded in anything that's going to motivate you long term. If anything, you're likely not going to be satisfied with what you're doing. The number of people I know who go into careers where it's just for just kind of to go through the day-to-day and just be an autopilot, essentially, and they feel less satisfied. If anything, it's like, I have a 9 to 5, but I feel robotic in it, and I don't feel a sense of purpose in this. That's where your internal state is not feeling what you're doing actionably externally. Relationships. You said family time, which is amazing, because when we think about quality time and meaningful relationships, essentially, right, it really helps us go back to this idea of mindfulness and presence. In our relationships, the ones we tend to cultivate very good relationships with, we're very present. When we're having conversations with them, we know that we can, we're literally looking them in the eye, our body language says it, right? We're very meaningful and active listening. If anything, the active listening itself will cultivate more presence and attentiveness, just generally. It's a good practice to have. And then it also elevates our sense of appreciation, which leads to increased levels of satisfaction. Does that make sense? Alright, so we covered 4. Got 3 more. Alright, we have generosity. Volunteering is incredible in that it gives you a sense of community and shared purpose in a way that allows you to feel more satisfied. It's also when generosity can also look like random acts of kindness. I think one thing that's interesting about random acts of kindness is that it helps to boost your mood because the purpose in which you're doing it is serving something beyond just the person itself. It's not always necessarily about just making the person smile. It's going beyond that. I'm doing this for the service of Allah. If they don't enjoy it, whatever it may be, you sort of, there's this letting go of it in the process of doing it. You're really doing it for the service of Allah, right? And that volunteering you're doing, a lot of people have been doing that in Ramadan, right? They've been volunteering for Masjid. I know at NYC, there are an incredible team of volunteers there that have been working day and night to make sure that a lot of our community are able to worship, right? So ultimately, you are serving a greater purpose than yourself, and you feel like you're missing out on what it is that you're doing in terms of worship, but you're also serving the community in a different way and allowing them to worship. If anything, you're getting the reward of the worshipers doing all the tarawih during Ramadan as well, because you're creating a space for them to be able to worship in a safe way. And in a nice way as well. Then we have self-compassion. When we talked earlier about ambition turning into very much low self-esteem, low self-worth, that was really around, there's a lot of negative self-talk that occurs with that, right? So self-compassion is actually an important piece when it comes to feeling satisfied with your life and feeling content. Because when we are able to replace critical language with kinder language to ourselves, we're helping to serve ourselves in that moment. Shaitan has a very clever way of getting to us by using negative self-talk, right? In moments where you may have made a mistake, are you hearing that Shaitan is being very understanding or telling you I can get it next time? No, he's likely saying, you missed it once, you can't do it again. Give up, that's it, right? So when he does that, what is he using? Essentially, he's kind of fueling that negative self-talk. So self-compassion is an important part of replacing that critical language and creating kinder talk. Because why do we need to help Shaitan? He's clever enough as it is, we don't need to help him in the process. Self-care rituals are really important in being able to make sure that we're rested and kind of creating that sense of self-compassion with ourselves. It is making sure that when we are recharged and rested, we're actually showing up for the people around us. There's this idea of resentment that's super interesting. When I think Brene Brown referenced this in her book, Atlas of the Heart. But when she talks about resentment in particular, she describes it as not, usually we associate it with anger. But it's actually under jealousy and envy. And so when you're feeling resentful of someone, you're actually speaking to what it is that you're missing. So if you're resentful of someone for taking a break, you're likely speaking to the fact that you probably want a break and you're just annoyed the other person is asking for or getting the break that they need, right? So focusing on yourself in that moment and actually giving yourself room to take a break is very important. Acceptance is the last one here, but it's being mindful to reflect on and contemplate how this world is very much temporary. We are travelers here ultimately. So there's a letting go that we need to do when it comes to focusing on what it is we're doing in the day-to-day. So if we're ambitious in achieving a goal, ultimately, I think I heard this in a video Ahlam did from Staten Island. I think it was the halaqa not too long ago. But she said, we're not judged by our efforts, that we're judged by our efforts, not the outcome. So it's our efforts that ultimately matter to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not the outcome, because the outcome is in His hands. Right? So if ultimately that's the case, then there's a level of relief that comes with that, right? You can be ambitious to achieve this goal, but ultimately you're leaving it up to Allah whether you receive it or not. And if that's the case, you feel a lot more content in that. So in that acceptance of it, you're letting go of what's out of your control, and you're really just focusing on, am I making the effort to get there, right? So in order for us to gain a sense of contentment, we have to make sure we're being intentional, purposeful, and mindful. Both the narrative we tell ourselves, ultimately, and the expectations we set influence and impact whether we can achieve that level of contentment. Alright, this is the last question for you guys, and then I'll leave it there. I think I've been talking way too much. But how can you integrate gratitude and mindfulness practice into your routine in these next couple of days, but also what do you want to maintain as you go exit Ramadan and we say goodbye to Ramadan, sadly? What do you want to kind of integrate into your routine?
I have two. One of them is little dark,
Love it.
so sorry. Well, I want to be able to prepare for my death. We're all gonna die. I want to be able to go to sleep, and if I'm dead, I'm gonna be happy with that. So I want to make sure I want to make sure my ibadah is in check, my debts are in check, my relationships with other people are in check. I want to be comfortable. Like I'm going to bed, I'm not gonna feel like, if I die tomorrow, I don't know what's gonna happen. That's what I want to strive for. That's what I learned this year. So inshallah, I could work on it.
I like that.
Someone died in the community, and a bunch of people. Every Ramadan, everybody, so many people die. But this year, I guess I was like, okay, do something, work on it.
If anything, I feel like I think the reason a lot of people have, because masajid have been full, like it is not the same as last year. I know it's because the world has just gone crazy in terms of what's been going on, how heavy the news has been, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in the Congo, right? There are so many different crises happening in the world, and I think it's a good reminder. I think we had two earthquakes this year? One earthquake and then an aftershock that happened afterwards. So it's a reminder. This is a temporary life. So are the goals you're creating for yourself ones that are serving you beyond this world? Are the things you are putting energy into the things that are going to matter if you pass tomorrow, right? So it's I think dark enough. It's not too dark at all. I think it's an important reminder. Anybody else?
Well, one thing is like kind of what you talked about, self-compassion. That's something like I noticed that like if not addressed, negatively affects you as a person and also rubs off onto others.
Yeah.
So like I noticed that me personally, I was like very critical of everyone. Anything they do, any sign of negativity or wrong that they do, like I just judge them as a bad person.
Yeah.
And I kind of just I just shoo them away. So just learning to be more forgiving, more accepting of people. That will help you also accept yourself and kind of develop that self-compassion so you can move forward. Be more forgiving of yourself, be more forgiving of others. And so you can also like receive the forgiveness of Allah, right? Like the mercy and forgiveness of Allah. So
I like that. It's huge. It's a feedback loop. We don't realize how much of an impact our relationship to ourselves then has on the relationships we have with our friends or our family members, and then even our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One thing that I very much noticed, both in my clients but also in myself as well, is often a lot of people who very much feel less confident in themselves or have heavy criticisms with themselves find themselves not asking Allah for what it is that they want because they don't think they're worthy enough of it, right? Their du'as may be more general because they don't think that Allah will, it's not even that they don't think Allah will give it to them, it's that I don't think I deserve it, right? And so that hurts your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who says you just need to walk towards Him and He'll run, right? So building that self-compassion also builds your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ultimately as well. Any others?
Replacing negative thoughts with like positive.
I like that. Okay. Really kind of incorporating it in your day to day.
I think to add on to the self-compassion, even though there's a lot of darkness currently, knowing that Allah is more than just that, like understanding that Allah is what you perceive Him as. So if you think of Him as a merciful being, a merciful creator, then ultimately that's how you shape your thoughts and how you shape your life. And that's something, inshallah, that I feel like I need to work on.
Yeah, I like that. I think what comes up in regards to that with my clients, for instance, is often, have you guys ever played the game Punch Buggy? Am I too old to? You know those yellow cars, like, that you rarely see, to be honest. They're the like yellow small cars. But growing up, one of the things we do at school is anytime you saw that car, you punch the person next to it. Which seems a bit violent to us, but when you think about it, the thing is, whenever we played that game, it's like the first time one person spotted it, all of a sudden I saw that car everywhere, and we were getting punched left and right. So it's this idea of like, when your mind is framed to a certain setting of like, I need to find this, it's going to find it, right? So if you are set to see the negative, if you are set to see what you don't have, you are going to find it, right? So ultimately, reframing, what do you have, what is out there, is what are your signs of mercy that you're seeing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're going to find it. So I really like that. Anybody else?
Always putting Allah first. Like if I have a decision and I'm doing something for the dunya, for example, studying or exercise, and I want something from that, I think one really important thing to understand is that, like you mentioned earlier, outcome is always in Allah's hands. So no matter what extra time that I put into this workout or this study session, if it takes away from my ability to get to the masjid on time for salah, then I need to weigh out my priorities better.
I like that. I like that. It's a good reframe, honestly. If we can let go of the outcome being in our hands, there's so much more relief in that we tend to receive. So for you, you're orienting my internal state. Is this something that I'm doing in service of Allah? If this is a goal that I have, is it going back to Allah or taking me closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Or is it taking me away, and do I need to reorient? Any others? Yeah.
I was just gonna say, being more intentional to like moving everything I do is being more intentional.
Intention is huge. I always thought this was a cheat code, but I had someone tell me like, if you take even the smallest thing that you're doing within the day and you change the intention to be in the service of Allah in some way, that is your route to making that action itself a worship to Allah, right? So even the act of eating. If you're eating mindlessly, ultimately you're just feeding your body really. But if you're saying and being intentional and you're making the intention that I am doing this because my body is a manna from Allah and I'm trying to take care of it through this, all of a sudden you eating that cheeseburger is an act of worship, right? So it's so interesting how something as small as that can like really shift our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I like that. Anyone else?
Sorry, I want more.
Go for it. Loving things.
It's the Quran. Like Quran is very hard for me to really reflect and read it because if it's a new surah, it's really hard for me to read. But this year I learned it's very easy. Just start. So like inshallah with us, Friday, come every Friday, girls and brothers. Come to the halaqa and then we'll do reflections. But it's so easy, and I've heard this saying like throughout I would say like maybe 3 months before Ramadan and in Ramadan. Quran is a letter from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He's speaking to you. So like reading it and like you'll see everything and it will touch you. So ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if it's hard for you. It's very hard for me. So I'm not saying like, oh, it's easy for me. No, it's really hard. So ask Allah to help you, and your heart is gonna start absorbing it and opening to it, and you're gonna see it. Slowly. Like I'm slowly seeing it. It's a beautiful connection. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to continue this connection after.
Ameen. I think there's even a reframe we can have there, because I think a lot of people, especially for born Muslims in particular, one of the things we might often grow up with, or it's a very similar experience that a lot of us have, is that often Islam was shown to us in a forceful and negative manner, right? That it wasn't necessarily an encouragement to be able to connect with Allah. It was more so you do this or you get hit. You do this or you get a consequence in turn, right? So that often for a lot of people associates things like reading the Quran or prayer, right, with something very negative. And if we think of the basic like psychology is just how we function as human beings, you can think of the experiment of Pavlov's dog, right? It's is everybody familiar with that? It's it's a conditioning exercise. The dog was given food, but they would ring a bell every time they would give it food. And all of a sudden now anytime the bell rang, even if food wasn't there, the dog would start to salivate, even if the food wasn't there. So it's this association that ends up happening. So if this is something that you struggle with, right, is that your connection to the Quran or prayer has come through something a little bit harsher, then it's how can you reframe that relationship with the Quran or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fit better for you, so that you feel less of a weight, because Islam is not meant to be heavy, right? And often we grow up thinking it's heavy. I used to have a Quran teacher who was so instrumental in how I reframed Islam in particular. Often we're taught Islam is a no religion. You can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this. And she came in and it was more about like, Islam gives us so much, and then there's these things over here that we can't do, but there's so much. And it was just, I think it was even implemented in action when we had like a ice skating trip, I think, that we did. And I remember we went to this ice skating trip, and naturally when Salat time came, it was just like, oh, we're just gonna pause skating for a little bit and we're gonna go to Salli. It's not that it prevented you from doing anything fun, it was making sure that you're incorporating Allah throughout your day and what you're doing. And so just that, the alteration of how you're seeing it and your relationship to it increases that relationship as well.
I think that's a really good point about slowly understanding that even though Allah has negated or said no to certain things, there's a purpose behind it. So everything that He has ordered has a purpose, and it's always for the good.
It's always for the better, even if we might not see it yet. Who's there?
I'd actually just like to add something to what you said. So like you mentioned, like a lot of times born Muslims, what they'll have to do is that a lot of times people have to relearn Islam.
Yeah.
So one huge thing I want to add to that is that in today's society, it's really important to actually allocate time into pondering. Because in previous societies, we had a lot less this stuff to do, a lot less phones, electronics constantly. And now we don't have enough time to ponder. Like for example, whereas years ago I'd walk down the street and I'd see the sun, and I'd see the trees, and I'd see the way that everything is so beautifully placed, it would help me ponder about Islam and what Allah has put on this dunya. And now in today's day and age, when I'm just have my face to my phone and I'm texting all the time while walking, it's really hard to sit down and actually ponder, because so many times we as Muslims, we have like miracles in our lives from Allah that will totally just go over our head if we don't just sit down for 1 second and think about how this happened and how this is really a miracle from Allah.
Yeah, it's only in reflection that you're able to see how far you've come, what Allah has placed in your life, or the du'as that He's accepted without you even realizing it, right? And this is one of the reasons I like those du'a lists that people do for New Year's instead of like just random like I'm gonna do this, this, and this. It's like du'as, but they'll then look at it the next year and see what Allah has accepted for them, right? Very much that reflection is very important. They're like holding space for that. All right. So to end off, I just want you to kind of take these questions with you as something to kind of ponder on. What will you take away from this conversation in regards to how we achieve a sort of sense of contentment in this life? When it comes to ambition, where is it influenced for you? Where do you want to improve when it comes to feeling more content? Where do you need to work on? And what strategies do you want to incorporate within your day to be able to balance the sense of ambition to achieve these goals, but also be very much content with what it is you have and being intentional in your day-to-day. All right, with that, assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Thank you so much for Sister Roua for that inspirational talk. Inshallah, tomorrow is going to be our last halaqah with Muhammad Badawi, who will talk about, what was it?
Quran is a guide.
Navigating the afterlife. Tomorrow's going to be a talk about navigating the afterlife, or a section on the post-death journey. Our revive of the month will be on the 27th of April with Sheikh Muhammad al-Shinawi, who will talk about the development of the four madhabs.